Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I'm Dr. Carmen Imes, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University. Today we're picking things up in Exodus 24 verses 9 through 11. Last week we read the covenant ratification ceremony, and now Moses and the others are going to ascend the mountain. I'll begin by reading from my translation of the Hebrew. Then Moses ascended, and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel. They saw the God of Israel, and under his feet was like hand-laid tiles of lapis lazuli, like the very skies for brightness. Against those set apart from the sons of Israel, he did not stretch out his hand. They had visions of God, they ate, and they drank. Okay, so in verses 1 and 2, we had the command from God to ascend the mountain, and then the ritual event happened at the base of the mountain, which we talked about last week. And finally, now we've come to the fulfillment of the command to ascend the mountain. You might remember from 2 videos ago that I talked about how there are 7 times in this chapter where there is an ascent up the mountain, or speaking of an ascent up the mountain. So 7 times Moses ascends or is told to ascend. This is part of that count. Who are Nadab and Abihu, or Nadab and Abihu? These are the sons of Aaron. They will become priests in the tabernacle eventually, but here they're brought along up the mountain as a member of the community of leaders of Israel who have elite access to the presence of God. In Leviticus chapter 9, we read a story about these 2 men. After the tabernacle is built, they bring unauthorized fire into the presence of the Lord, and that fire comes out and destroys them. They're zapped. This is a really sober warning not to think of yourself as being above the law. Even the priests are subject to the law that God gives at Mount Sinai. They don't get to make the rules. So they become arrogant, thinking, oh, wow, we've been up the mountain. We've got to be in the presence of God. We can kind of have access, do whatever we want. And God warns them and all who follow that being in leadership does not give you permission to act of your own accord. You have to remain under the teaching of the Lord and remain obedient to his command. In verse 10, those who ascend partway up the mountain see God. It says they saw God. Well, how can they see God? In chapter 33, verse 20, it says, no one can see my face and live. So how do we reconcile the impossibility of seeing God with this chapter's claim that they saw God? There are a couple of possible ways of thinking about this. First, these men were invited to ascend. They are not just coming of their own accord. So maybe that's the difference. Or maybe the difference is that they only saw God's feet, not God's face. A human being cannot survive an encounter with the full impact of God's radiance. The Septuagint, the LXX, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, renders this that they saw the place where the God of Israel stood. So it seems like the translators of the Septuagint are also wrestling with the apparent contradiction between those who saw God and no one can see me and live. And so they said they saw the place where God stood. And it's true that what is described in this passage is around God's feet. What seems really clear from the context is that they're not getting the full experience of the glory of God. What they're seeing is amazing and wonderful and glorious, but it's partial. They're not seeing the full impact of God's presence. In verse 11, we get a different word for seeing. They had visions of God. The Hebrew word chazah is not the typical word for seeing. It's used on occasions of prophetic sight, prophetic vision, or in situations of prayer where someone has an encounter with God, or an experience of discerning the truth about something. So it's not just seeing, it's a deep kind of seeing that involves discerning God's presence. The fact that they see God's feet and the pavement where his feet are resting indicates that there's a vibe in this passage about the rule of God. There are a number of places in the Bible where it talks about God's enemies being placed under his feet. And this is actually a common trope in the ancient world. You'll even see in Egypt statues of Pharaoh where the enemies are carved into stone below the feet of Pharaoh to show that Pharaoh has conquered them or subjugated them. So the fact that this passage says that they saw under his feet, that there were these tiles like brickwork of lapis lazuli, is an indication that they're in the throne room of God. They're seeing his rule, his enthronement. Lapis lazuli is sometimes translated as sapphire, and it's understandable why a translator would do that because the Hebrew word for lapis lazuli is sapphire, from which we get the word sapphire. But this is not the same stone. I'm actually wearing a sapphire today. This is not a genuine one, but it's a lab created sapphire, and you can see that it's a deep blue, but it's also clear. And lapis lazuli is a similar color, but it's opaque and flecked with gold pyrite. So it's not the same thing. It would be a little bit more like a turquoise stone. If you've seen turquoise, you know it's opaque. You can't see through it. It doesn't reflect light through it. And so what they're seeing is some really brilliant bricks of lapis lazuli that are under the throne of God. And the idea of them being bricks, like brickwork, or what did I say, like hand-laid tiles, kind of echoes their making of bricks for Pharaoh. There's a contrast here. Now, it's not clear whether the bricks are above their head and they're seeing the pavement and then somehow seeing through it to the feet of God, or whether when they bow down, they're seeing the bricks because they're on the pavement. The text makes a point of telling us that God did not stretch out his hand against them, even though they're in his presence. Even a partial exposure to God's glory is dangerous, but God doesn't strike them because he had invited them to come near. I love the way the Bible Project video on holiness talks about this, using the analogy of the sun. The sun's warmth and light are a gift. They are essential to life on earth. We're grateful for them, but if you get too close to the sun, you would be zapped. And in a similar way, God's holiness is wonderful and good and awesome, but close proximity to holiness when you're in a state of unholiness is downright dangerous. The safety that these men, these leaders feel in the presence of God is marked by a fellowship meal. They eat and drink with God. This might remind us of chapter 18, where Moses and Jethro sit together and eat a meal. It's a way of indicating trust between two parties. You can't wield weapons when you're sitting at a table together. And you can also check out Genesis 14:18 and Psalm 23, verse 5 for other examples of this idea of a fellowship meal between people. Those who went up the mountain with Moses were those who would become priests, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders. Verse 11 calls them those set apart. And that's the Hebrew word atzil. This has been translated various ways by different translators. So those who see an Arabic cognate word for atzil translate it either as nobles or distinguished ones, or sometimes rooted. It's translated rooted, but we can actually relate this to a Hebrew term that means to be set apart or reserved. So these are men who were set apart or reserved for this unique experience of approaching the presence of God. As I said 2 weeks ago in the video, the mountain has different tiers of access so that only Moses can go all the way up. The elders can come part way up and the people have to stay at the base. And this mimics what we see in the tabernacle, where only the high priest has access to the most holy place, and then the priests have access to the holy place, and the common people can come in the courtyard. So there's a sense that the closer you get to the presence of God, the more careful you need to be to prepare yourself and to be in a state of holiness, and you need to be selected and invited by God to approach him in this way. So this is bringing us partway up the mountain. Moses is partway up. Next week, he's going to go the rest of the way, and we'll see what happens. Until then, have a great week.